And with the dizzying array of technology being introduced every day, there's new terminology, the manufacturers using different some terms to describe and differentiate and distinguish themselves from other manufacturers. It's indeed very confusing and something that will be addressed in the lectures tomorrow. But when it comes to 3D imaging, always remember this holy triangle, that there's only three things that determine this quality of a 3D image. Number one is the sector size, number two is the temporal resolution, and number three is the spatial resolution. It's only a matter of juggling between what you want to see and how fast you want to see and how good you want to see it. For example, if you want to have a high spatial resolution, the requirement is a high line density, as we read in the physics on Sunday. But the trade-off is the sector size will go high, has to be reduced, and of course the temporal resolution will go down. If you want a higher temporal resolution, the requirement is a low line density and a narrow sector, but it leads to a lower spatial resolution. And again, if you increase the sector size, of course, your line density and your temporal resolution will reduce. So you can't have everything like in real life. You have to make a trade-off and decide what your top priority is before you go on and use an imaging mode. So essentially, there are three imaging modes. Number one is simultaneous orthogonal plane imaging, which is referred to as different names by different manufacturers, that can be used with or without color. The other is live probe responsive imaging, which is the image that moves with the probe, that again is used with or without color. And the last, that what Greg explained at the end, was the R-wave gated multi-beat reconstruction, that again with or without color. So simultaneous orthogonal plane imaging, while it's not as sexy as the rest of the 3D imaging mode, but it is useful clinically and used more often and beginning to be used more often as we go along and delve into structural heart disease interventions that require real-time imaging guidance. What it leads to is a user-selected reference two-dimensional plane, and a corresponding orthogonal plane is generated at the same time. It's generally one, but some manufacturers allow multiple orthogonal plane generation. Now, the position of the orthogonal plane can be adjusted and can be altered not only in the elevational plane of the 3D plane, but also in rotation. So as you can see, a frustum is an inverted, a pyramidal-shaped scan plane that comes out of it. A biplane image is essentially two individual 2D scan planes that are generated at the same time from the edge of the probe. And what it does is, the most important thing is that we can interrogate more complex shaped structures. For example, looking at a mitral valve in two angles on two scan planes at the same time can sometimes be very important. And as you can see, that the mitral valve is a much more complex structure than we assume it to be. Having to see it in two different orthogonal planes can sometimes be much more useful than generating an en-face view, which has its own limitations here. Now, some manufacturers allow not just one, but three simultaneous orthogonal planes. This is, again, more information. Seeing the same structure from multiple views at the same time can also be extremely useful, particularly for assessment of regurgitation jets, left atrial appendage, as you can see for this one, and structural heart disease interventions, and particularly for procedural guidance. When most of our cardiology colleagues are not used to looking at three-dimensional images the way we generate them on the screen, to them, the orthogonal plane image makes more sense. So it is actually more useful for them and helps them more in guiding their catheters and other devices in the septum and on the valves if they are able to see them in two orthogonal views. And particularly, as I said, complex regurgitation jets, which are eccentric, flattening out on the left atrial wall, which when seen in two different positions and two different planes can generate far more information and clinically relevant than seeing them in a three-dimensional image. Left atrial appendage, as we go on to do more closures for percutaneous closure of left atrial appendage, this again is a very important imaging plane for such intracardiac interventions. As you can see, the septal puncture, as we'll go through the structural heart disease symposium, is kind of forms the basis of what you do in the left side of the heart during percutaneous interventions. And while 3D imaging is very good and essential for it, the most important part of transseptal puncture is be able to see the needle tenting the intraatrial septum in two orthogonal views, both in the supra-inferior and the anteroposterior directions. Similarly, position of intracardiac devices. This is a atrial septal occluder being viewed in two orthogonal views in 0 and 90 degrees. And so this is more important than seeing a beautiful three-dimensional view of this atrial occluder device from the en-face left atrial or the right-sided view, because you can see the position of the intraatrial septum or a rim around the device in all views.